You tweeted that, quote, once you start thinking of Bitcoins as a continuous quantity like a liquid rather than discrete units like atoms, things start to make a lot more sense. Make sense of this for us.
Yeah, so for some reason on Bitcoin Twitter, we've been having a lot of metaphysical debates recently. That tweet was inspired because I'd had a discussion with Francis Coppola on the What Bitcoin Did podcast.
Yeah.
And, we had a long discussion on that show about whether Bitcoin is truly scarce because it's divisible. And the way I think it's easier to think of you get confused when you start trying to boil Bitcoin down to the smallest unit, down to the Satoshi, and you start wondering, well, maybe couldn't you just create more decimal places and infinitely, maybe it's infinitely divisible. And I think it's a little confusing, especially because Bitcoin is this dematerialized, digital thing. I think of it as a single quantity, which then gets divided up into different segments. And so, UTXOs, to me, those are containers, and they contain sort of arbitrary quantities of Bitcoin. And, I think this is a better analogy to think about it because it's actually not a cash scheme where you have bills like DigiCash or any of those other eCash schemes where you had serialized kind of bills, right, in different denominations. You'd have many fixed denomination bills and you'd have to sort of recirculate them. Like those were prior eCash schemes. Part of Satoshi's genius was he just treated Bitcoin as this kind of continuous quantity, and you're just managing the transfer of different quantities of Bitcoin, and it sort of flows through the network, and the protocol makes sure that there's no additional Bitcoin being created. So it's a metaphysical debate, but I guess because Bitcoin is so hard to really reason about, I think it's important to sometimes you rely on these analogies, basically.
Right. I tweeted something not too long ago where basically the idea was there is one Bitcoin.
Yeah.
There's just one.
I fully agree.
Right? There's just one.
I fully agree.
And then we go down the path of dividing it, but it's essentially there's only one. What about the statement that you can only create absolute scarcity once? I find this to be very profound, and I kind of intellectually work around it in my mind. But what are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, I think the circumstances of Bitcoin's birth are unrepeatable. And I think if another competitor were to take over Bitcoin, then that competitor would face the same problem and recursively. So I think the social contract that we sort of implicitly agreed to is we're all going to treat this thing as if it's unique and scarce, and it became unique and scarce. And there's also historical contingencies, which mean that Bitcoin had amazing advantages. It could have gone much worse, the launch of Bitcoin. I think it went as well as conceivably possible. You had this almost 2-year period where it was worth basically nothing. And so it was kind of freely dispersed. And because it wasn't monetized from scratch, you didn't have all these like predatory funds come in and try and get all the Bitcoin, So like if you compare it to other times you've had to distribute things to communities from scratch, think about the privatization of the Soviet Union after it collapsed. You had these voucher programs that were distributed to citizens of what became Russia. And what happened was a lot of them sort of didn't really understand the value of the thing. And they sold them really cheaply to all these funds, and the oligarchs managed to get all the vouchers. So if you have a system where it's valuable from the start, there's going to be an extreme incentive for larger players to come up and acquire all of the units. But if it's valueless at the start, then it's the hobbyists that acquire it. So we went right to the precise, correct constituency who did the faucets, they distributed the coins. Laszlo had 80,000 coins. He got rid of them through his pizza transactions. He had all of this generosity, but it wasn't so difficult because Bitcoins were worthless. And this gave it a base of hobbyists and users, as opposed to, a handful of hedge funds. If Bitcoin had been monetized from the start, and we obviously see this with coin offerings today, the first buyers are all hedge funds. If it had been monetized from the start, it wouldn't have had that opportunity. And it wouldn't have been able to get this buy-in from this amazingly diverse kind of global community of users. So I think the circumstances are unique. And now that digital money exists as a concept, you can't repeat that. Because if you were to make a Bitcoin 2.0 and, like, somehow Satoshi returned and said, hey, I've built a better Bitcoin, like I'm going to, start now, that would, billions of dollars would immediately flow in from the largest funds in the world to try and get a privileged access to the system. So I hate it when people downplay the circumstances of Bitcoin's birth. They are totally unique and unrepeatable. Very, very special origin story, I think. One of the best kind of myths, but it's a true story. So it's amazing.